I'll be your moderator for this particular session. My name is Halima Ahmed, currently a policy and research associate at the African Leadership Center, focusing on the Horn region. Eunice is one of our panelists today. Eunice is a lawyer, a feminist, and development specialist with considerable experience in advancing social justice at national, regional, and international level. Eunice is the current executive director of Akina Mama Africa, a Pan-African leadership development organization. Her first book is titled Nurture or Nature, Sowing Seeds of Greatness. Her passions include reading, writing, spending quality time with friends and family, and exploring what humanity has got to offer. Eunice possesses a bachelor's degree in law from the University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, master's in business administration, majoring in public policy analysis from the University of Birmingham, United Kingdom, with several other professional training in feminist leadership, human rights, good governance, and social accountability. She's also held positions of responsibility at governance level in non-governmental organizations, including member of the Board Civic Response on Environment and Development, CRED, chairperson FIDA Uganda, FIDA Uganda board member, Human Rights Network Uganda, also known as HURINET, board member, amongst others. Thank you so much, Eunice, for joining us. Nyawira is a Kenyan feminist, passionate about investing in the leadership potential and personal transformation of girls and young women in rural Kenya. We had her say that earlier on. Nyawira brings nearly or about 13 years experience in the feminist organization or organizing space, where she's worked extensively with rural communities around the country. Nyawira's advocacy is anchored in the belief that when girls are given space to dream, ideate, and be ambitious, they can truly live in their power and transform their lives and those of their communities. She holds a master's in security, leadership, and society from King's College London, and a bachelor's in sociology and philosophy from the University of Nairobi. Nyawira is an alumnus of the African Leadership Center, Scholars Program, and the Research Center for Women and Girls Empowerment Retreats. She currently serves as its executive director, where she leads a diverse team of young women. Thank you so much, Nyawira, for joining us. And last but not least, Lorna. Merikaji Lorna Nanjia is the Secretary General for South Sudan Democratic Engagement, Monitoring and Observation Program, a civil society organization that was founded before independence in 2009. She's made significant contributions in advancing civic participation in national processes, including the multi-stakeholder IGAD-led South Sudan peace negotiations in Addis Ababa in 2014-2015. She's an activist, and until June 2023, served as the women's representative in the National Constitution Amendment Committee. Merikaji has been involved in several civic engagement processes in South Sudan. She currently represents civil society in the Oversight Committee for Public Finance Management Reform Processes in the country. She holds a bachelor's degree in biomedical technology from the University of Nairobi and a master's degree in public management and international cooperation from Cal University of Applied Sciences in Germany. Her research interests is participatory governance and human rights, and in 2020, she was recognized among global human rights defenders and awarded the prestigious Franco-German Award for Human Rights Defenders. Thank you so much, Lorna, for joining us. So our discussion for this particular conversation is on catalyzing equality in Africa, spotlighting women's leadership and agency in gender-responsive financing. So from my little back and forth understanding, I'd like to go ahead and say that I think catalyzing equality in Africa through spotlighting women's leadership and agency in gender-responsive financing is a pivotal and important initiative, which I think, courtesy of all of us being here, is aimed at addressing the systemic gender inequalities across the African continent. And I think that by emphasizing the leadership roles of women and their agency in financial decision-making processes, this particular discussion and approach seeks to empower women as we all are here, economically and socially. And I think that it is a particularly important conversation because through targeting financing mechanisms such as grants, loans, investment programs, it also aims to breach the gender gap in access to resources and opportunity. By recognizing and amplifying the contributions of women leaders in various sectors, I believe not only fosters economic growth, but also promotes inclusive development that benefits entire communities. With that said, I think we'd go right into the conversation and maybe start with Lorna and then Nyamira and then Eunice on what spotlighting women's leadership and agency in gender-responsive financing means to you.
Thank you very much. I think this is quite interesting. And you know, when I got the invitation, I was thinking about the whole theme, and my mind went to where is the gap? Where are we missing it? And I think one of the things that I would always say is that gender budgeting, or when you talk about the whole ecosystem around finances and resourcing, it's perceived to be technical, yet it's something that affects day-to-day lives. So there is always a gap. And I think for us to be able to catalyze women's leadership in gender-responsive budgeting and financing, we need to look at the knowledge gap. Where is the knowledge gap? And we have to find ways of bridging the knowledge gap. And that means we need to have a pool of necessary information required to facilitate and catalyze women's leadership in this arena. But that depends on the context. Because I would say for a fact that sometimes when we don't pay attention to the knowledge gap, we end up watering down the gains that we have made. We end up contradicting. And it's a very technical conversation where a slight twist or a slight realignment may mean losing huge amount of money. Number two is, or this is my number three now, is that we need to cascade. In as much as we talk about the ecosystem around financing and gender budgeting, where gender budgeting exists, we need to cascade. We need to be able to stratify. So when we talk about cascading, we should be able to know what connects to what. And we should be able to look at national resources. How does gender budgeting and financing operate or apply in the national resources? And in that case, we will be looking at national budget, but we're also looking at revenue generated from national resources. This would include natural resources. In our case, petroleum is a very important the revenue contributing resource that South Sudan has, but it could be different in other countries. Again, in that case, you'll realize that there's an element of diversification. So when we diversify, how do we see women's leadership in sectors like maybe gold mining? Where are women in this? You know, that for me is level one in country plus many more, including in non-oil revenue, which is the taxation. How many women in the market are contributing? And then how does it trickle down to interest, to women's interest? But then again, the other thing that may be unique to South Sudan is the question of priority within development aid that comes to South Sudan. How is the priority set? And how can we catalyze women's leadership to be able to sit at decision-making tables, to be able to prioritize within development aid that comes to South Sudan? What aspect of it should go to women, and including the youth and the children? How do we engender this whole process and ensure that everybody's interest is kind of comprehensively addressed? I think when you talked about catalyzing women's leadership, I'm asking myself, how do we see women's interest positioned in all these places, but in a cascaded manner where one level feeds into the other? Thank you. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Halima, and thank you for inviting me. It's nice to see your faces. Hi, Eunice. And I think for
Sorry, Nyamira, you've been muted.
Hi, am I back?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was saying I always like to simplify issues. I like to simplify language because I work with adolescent girls, and for them to understand some of these technicalities and language that is always adopted at in spaces has to translate into something meaningful for them and meaningful language that they understand. So when we talk about catalyzing, like Lorna said, it's a technical issue that affects the day-to-day lives of women, girls, and non-binary folk. So what that means for me, I would speak from like at community level, is what I see on a day-to-day basis. Does gender responsive financing translate into meaningful health outcomes for adolescent girls and young women and non-binary folk? How does that translate? Does catalyzing women's leadership actually translate into meaningful outcome for these groups of marginalized people? Is it enough having women sitting in this leadership position, and what else needs to happen? I know I'm asking a question after you've asked me a question, but I feel like these are necessary questions to ask to better understand the root cause and the root issue of what we're discussing here, right? And I would say that in my experience in Kenya, having women in leadership spaces does not always translate into meaningful participation, does not always translate into implementation of policies, does not always translate into outcomes that are beneficial for women, girls, and non-binary people. So what that means for me then is a rethinking of the questions we are asking. Like, let's go back to basics. Are these the correct questions? Is it just about having women in these positions, right? If we have 50 of them, does that mean that a girl in a certain rural area in Kenya will receive medical supplies in her hospital because there was a thinking behind the placement, the selection of those women in those positions? And by them being there, they are thinking about the people in the community, in the grassroots level, who don't even understand what gender-responsive budgeting is. They just want supplies in hospital. They just want access to medicine. You know, they just want to be treated by doctors who know what they're doing, right? They want books in school. So I think for me, that would be the question to ask. Does catalyzing that leadership of women translate into meaningful outcome for the people who need these services most, who need an implementation of gender-responsive finances from the top to trickle down to the bottom? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nyamira. These are very pertinent questions that we all need to be thinking about. It's imperative considering the amount of women, I would say, who are now trapped in the upcoming generation, for lack of a better word, in terms of ensuring that, you know, they're rightly guided when it comes to finance and responsibility around it, and especially women and girls and non-binary people in non-city spaces, because a lot of the times we tend to talk about different things and have discussions around them, but we don't bear in mind the communities that are non-city based. We just look at them from a city lens. And I think it's very important that we drive the conversation towards not just city-based women and binary people and girls, but just the overall magnitude of the population of women, girls, and non-binary people outside of major cities in Africa. Eunice? Maybe just to hear from you in terms of anything around our topic of the day.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Halima, and good afternoon or good morning or good evening, wherever you are. Nice to see everyone and nice to be part of this panel. I think Nyawira has set a challenge to say we must simplify all this language. And so I have to rethink what I had planned to say, but nonetheless, I must say that this year's theme for the International Women's Day, or for the Commission on the Status of Women, accelerating the achievement of gender equality, and specifically on addressing poverty and strengthening institutions and financing with a gender perspective, is very spot on, given where we are at in our countries in Africa in terms of rising costs of living. Kenya has been having questions and protests around that. In terms of the tax crisis, we're being taxed left, right, and center. And we can have a conversation around regressive tax systems in Africa and what that means in terms of financing our public services, which we also know that are most consumed by women across the board, not just women who are urban-based, but especially so for women who are based in rural areas. So it's such an apt conversation to have right now, given also the war and conflict that is happening in Ukraine and Russia. You would think that that is so far off from us here in Africa, but it has impacted immensely on the rising food prices because Africa still imports a lot of food, and that is not by mistake, it's by design. And so when we think about what we need to do, then we have to be intentional about how we redress that design. And so some others have termed also the moment that we are in as a polycrisis. So in terms of planetary Earth, the climate crisis. So all those are intersecting to affect where we are at this moment. And so I would say for me, the theme gives us an opportunity to deeply reflect. It gives us an opportunity to reimagine, and it gives us an opportunity to also advance alternatives, which gladly I would say that feminists have already actually thought about. So when you think about even in terms of gender-based budgeting, it's a feminist issue. So thinking around ensuring that the budgets are responsive to the different needs of the population, and especially those that are mostly minoritized, are vulnerable, or are on the margins of life. So when we think about that, but what I wanted to quickly speak to is that even post-COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of our countries are struggling in terms of raising domestic revenues on one side, and on the other side, they are also struggling with paying back debt. So there's a debt crisis. So even when we are having this conversation, it needs to be couched in the bigger conversation of the financing model that we inherited, remains a legacy, and continues to dominate and continues to discriminate women. So what's that financing architecture that we inherited from colonialists that has continued to impact on us? For countries that are going through a debt crisis, there's conversation around what that means in terms of financing public services, education, health, agriculture, across the board, I would say. So I would say that for us to even begin thinking around a gender-responsive financing system, we need to look at what has brought us here, why are we where we are at, and what then can we do to redress. And I think we'll speak more of that as part of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eunice, and for everyone else on their insights on today's discussion. Just to jump right back into the discussion, what specific policy recommendations, for us to put it that way, would you propose to governments and international organizations to promote the integration of gender-responsive financing into national development agendas, respective of your countries? Maybe we could just go back to Lorna and then Nyamira and Eunice.
Well, thank you very much. I think before we get to specific policy recommendations, I think there are very important things that my colleagues, fellow panelists have raised. One, Nyawira has talked about the question of simplifying the language. I think it's a very important, it's profound. Thank you very much, Nyawira, because some of these languages have to remain as technical as it is at the higher level, but then at the impact level, we have to simplify it. So how are we doing this in the course of what I said earlier, cascading it, breaking it down? It's important for us. When we talk about catalyzing, you sent my mind back to medical school, and I was asking myself, what is the catalytic effect of what we are doing? You know, if we say that we are the catalyst, there has to be a catalytic effect. And what are we doing? And some of the catalytic actions that need to be done is what Nyawira has said: simplify the language, you see. And to simplify the language, for me, the whole concept needs to be simplified, because some change agents, people who call themselves change agents, some organizations, and this includes national and international organizations, they take the concept and jump on bandwagon, and it's just speaking gender-responsive budgeting. Let's talk about gender-responsive budgeting, but they themselves do not even understand. Therefore, programming does not even reflect what is being said. That's number one. Number two is understand the rule of the game. And this comes to the question, the policy question you have asked. The game is broad, and the game includes multilaterals. And the game includes multinational businesses. We cannot afford to see it in a very simplistic way, because resources, like I talked about the oil revenue. In South Sudan, yes, we could talk about the oil revenue. That is the major resource contributing to our national budget and our national resources. But then it involves multinationals into this business. What are the games? What are the rules of the game? We need to start addressing the policies that govern the rule of the game. And this includes the language that is included in the contracts, because some of these things can be addressed through social corporate responsibility. Some of these things, if women understand, then they can be able to hold the companies accountable, to be able to put pressure on the government to ensure that to do business with the country, the budget process has to be gender responsive, and there has to be allocation for addressing gender needs in the country. But then the question is, how much knowledge do we have about this? This is an area that is quite opaque. So one of the things, the recommendation to change agents is to empower ourselves with the knowledge about this sector. Try to understand so that we can strategically position our ask. And when we strategically position our ask, you realize that the representation that we have along the line is able to produce results. And Nyawira raised a very important question that we have always asked Nyawira. The question has persisted, and I think gender rights activists need to ask this question: do we often take time to differentiate between participation and representation? Because sometimes we have representation and we perceive it to be participation. If somebody sits around the table, I mentioned earlier about the position of a gender advisor. A gender advisor did amazingly well. But if she sat in that place and did not raise the gender issues, we would not have seen impact. So the question of participation, and this brings me to my final point: how do we get people who have the right knowledge in the right place? But coming to recommendations for gender responsive budgeting, I think countries need to adapt gender responsive budgeting as a policy, because then when budget ceilings are set, when priorities are being set for the country, it is a policy that process has to be engendered. There has to be at every step, there has to be a question of what will the young people of this country benefit from this kind of priorities? When we set a priority, what is in it for the women and what is in it for the older generation or for development of the country? So I think for us, for me, one of the biggest recommendations is to ensure that gender responsive budgeting is adapted as a policy in the country. The other things would follow, the question of taxation. Maybe I can stop here and bring in the other aspects later. Allow me to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna.
Yeah, thanks, Lorna. Thanks, Eunice, for raising some pertinent issues there. You know, there is a poly crisis, and we really have to think back. We have to look back. Where are we coming from before we can even start making recommendations, right? I think my question would be, again, another question: do we need more recommendations, right? Do we need more policies? What are we doing with the ones that are there? Like we said, I don't know, I think, Lorna, you talked about knowledge gaps, right? And it's not just knowledge on the policy level, it's also knowledge at grassroots level. So knowledge from people who are making these policies, who are they prioritizing? Who is in these policies? Who is being represented? Whose voices are being prioritized? And which voices are missing in these policies? How can we bring the voices that are missing along? Right? Kenya has, even in the constitution, you know, provisions around gender responsive budgeting. There's lots of work that has gone around in terms of policy to ensure that national government, county government has policies around responding to gender needs. But then, is there really an understanding of what that is? You know, if we make recommendations on this platform, you know, who is listening? Who's going to take the notes to present to who? You know, do they understand what we are talking about? Do they that point Lorna makes about ensuring that the right people are in the room, the right people who with the right knowledge, right? And feminists have been doing this work for a long time. But the minute you say feminist in these policy spaces is almost like a bad word, right? I don't know why the disconnect between the work feminist activists do and the work of the governments, you know, why can't we work together and synergize our knowledges, you know, our resources, so that they can translate into impactful outcomes for the people this gender responsive financing and budgeting is meant for. So I think that's one point that, again, how can we synergize our efforts? Because I know civil society is doing a lot of work in the ground to at least raise civic awareness. However, do they understand, like Lorna said, the language, you know, the gender responsive budgeting? Is it translating into the programmatic activities and interventions that they are doing, right? Eunice raised a point about tax collection. The word tax is almost like a bad word in Kenya because left, right, and center, we are being taxed. We are being taxed. So outside of taking money out of our paychecks, taking money out of our businesses, what does that mean for people who work hard for their money, women who, you know, are up crack of dawn to make ends meet? And the little they make is being taken, half of that goes towards tax, you know. And is that tax even translating into what they need the most, the basic necessities? So I think we have to, again, we have to rethink many things about who's in the room, who are these policies meant for? Are they inclusive? Are the voices being prioritized, bringing everyone along? Who are we leaving behind? So I feel like Kenya specifically has a lot of policies on that. And the recommendation would now be the trickling down of what the policies and the thick documents talk about to actual work on the ground. Yeah.
Thank you, Nura, for your input. Eunice?
Thank you. And once again, I associate with the panelists that have just spoken. I associate with their views. And I'll just maybe speak to an issue that has been on my mind since last year, really, on the issue of the debt crisis, because we all know that for resources, and if our resources as Africa are being channeled to servicing debts, then it means that we've taken away resources that would otherwise be applied to ensure that women can access health, that women can access trade or financial provisions for them to trade, or that women are not even able to educate their children. So I would say for me, my main recommendation would be for African countries, one, to really think deeply about domestic resource mobilization and how that is going to happen. And one of the things that I've been battling with is how African countries are not able to even stem the monies that we are losing as a continent. So I was going to say illicit financial flows, but since Nyaruya has told us to speak simply, so I would say the monies that we lose as a continent, when you think about the millions or the billions that we are losing annually, maybe to tax incentives, that money could be applied as part of domestic resources to our transformation. African Union has told us, for example, that we require 75% of our resources to be mobilized domestically. And at the same time, increase investments in country. But how will that happen? And that means that we need to be able to stop losing money from the continent. We lose more money from the continent than we attract in terms of aid. Or so actually our focus should not even be development aid. It should be the monies that we continue to lose. And what that means, it means that we really need to restructure our tax systems to ensure that we are not losing this money. I would also say that, of course, domestic resources, raising these resources will take time. So it means that we should be able to also think about the sort of monies that we are getting in debt and whether they are going to the right projects. So at individual level, think about it. If I was just getting money to buy more clothes and buy more shoes and buy more hair accessories, of course, that's not going to lead to transformation. But that's what our governments are doing. They are acquiring all these loans at such high interest rates and are not going to productive projects that are able to generate sufficient growth for us to pay back that debt in the future. So we are mortgaging the future of our children and our children's children in terms of how much money we are borrowing at high interest rates. And so if you look, for example, at the global north, they do not borrow at high interest rates. But for us, we are. And that's why we are having problems even repaying back these monies, because they're at such high interest rates. And then we're not generating the sufficient revenues. And there are so many countries that are either, if you think about Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, Zambia, Malawi, we could name all our countries. We're all going through a moment which we went through in the 80s in terms of debt crisis, but we are back to that same space. So for me, my key recommendation will be really that our African states, our African governments, our African stakeholders really need to rethink the issue of domestic resource mobilization, debt crisis, and ensuring that there's better management of our internal resources so that we have resources to function as nations.
Thank you so much, Eunice. I know it's almost like a Roman Empire-esque kind of question to have policies or rather policy recommendations at the beginning of a conversation. But I'm glad that Lorna mentioned that, and Nyawira, of course, and Eunice, in terms of the fact that we already have structured policies in place. It's just that how we navigate them or who's in the room is of what great importance. Mentioning understanding the game, Lorna, I think that was very, very important in terms of addressing the language that Nyawira had highlighted that dictates the rule of the game when it comes to the national budget, restructuring the tax system due to the regressive taxation that Eunice had mentioned. I think all of these are very, very pertinent in looking forward in terms of how we can incorporate African women in financing. Just to bandwagon on what she had said, Eunice, maybe I could get a pin note direction or idea of you operating at a national, international, regional level throughout your career. Maybe ask then, how do you or how have you navigated the varying contexts and dynamics inherent in each level of engagement, especially concerning gender-responsive financing and social justice in your work?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Halima. I think Nyawira spoke about ensuring that, or Lorna spoke about ensuring that the women or the actors that are in the room have sufficient knowledge. So one of the things that we do as Akina Mama Africa, as a feminist Pan-African organization, is really to create spaces for raising political consciousness about the issues that we are deeply passionate about. So we are looking at building or creating a critical mass of feminists that are deeply passionate about these issues, but also have the knowledge, the networks, and the spaces to engage. So at national level, at regional level, at international level, to be able, one, to do that feminist analysis. Secondly, to be able to organize against some of these issues that we are passionate about. And then also to be able to connect the dots, because we also apply an intersection of feminist lens to everything that we do. So we do not live single issue lives. So if something is affecting me in terms of my health, in terms of sexual and reproductive health and rights, it's also because the economics are not working. So being able to connect those dots. So the spaces we create through the African Women's Leadership Institute, which we consider an incubation center for African feminists to be able to engage with these issues. One of the issues that has been raised, for example, is that some of these issues are complex, and therefore we need to demystify how complex they are. And so such a safe space, so I would say safe and bold spaces, help us, one, to demystify the issues, to be able to come together as activists. So one of the things that is also not working well is the silos that we work in. So if I'm working on health, I'm not connecting the dots to, say, the economics. So being able to break those silos is also important, but then also building a transnational movement. So making sure that we are connecting as African women, as African feminists that are passionate about these issues, creating spaces for also mutual learning how it's working, for example, in South Sudan, how it's working in Ethiopia, and what we learn that then we can apply in our own individual contexts. So I would say that's one thing that we are doing. And of course, there are lots of lessons to learn from that. We can do more, we can do better. But then the other thing is also to make sure that we generate evidence, and a number of actors are actually generating the evidence that is required for these advocacy initiatives. So one of the things we celebrate as Africans, as African feminists, is even the fact that previously the tax regime was housed exclusively under OECD. But last year, the UN took a decision to ensure that the UN is now responsible for tax systems and structuring. That is a huge win in terms of democratizing decision making, because we know, of course, OECD is an exclusive club. So while the UN may not necessarily be as inclusive, but at least it is a step in the right direction. It has more countries, it has more egalitarian representation. So such wins then help us to be able to move forward in our advocacy, especially on such complex issues. But that could only happen because of the evidence, the working together, the transnational organizing, and the lobbying. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eunice. Maybe just to build on what you mentioned around feminist leadership and the values and principles. So from your experience, I think I'd like to inquire what feminist leadership values and principles have been useful in helping you navigate spaces and subject matters such as this one today on financing, especially in an area or arena that I would say is historically, specifically male-dominated.
So I would say the feminist value of power sharing is the one that has helped quite a bit, recognizing and appreciating that we are a movement. We are here to work together. It's not about competition, but collaboration. It's about bringing in more people into the room, ensuring that we have that lens to ask who is in the room, who is not in the room. How can we ensure that those are not in the room need to be in the room? So that is one of the critical principles that has helped us to navigate such spaces or such male-dominated conversations, or where systems of power are deeply, deeply entrenched. So asking who is in the room, who is not in the room, and who needs to get in. So the feminist principle of power sharing, I think that's important. And of course, the other that I would like to draw on is intersectionality. I think that's such a powerful way of working. It's such a powerful approach because it helps us to analyze the issues, not from a single base, but really look at what other issues are reinforcing. For example, we often say that patriarchy is reinforced by capitalism and they are like Siamese twins. So being able to apply that intersectional lens helps you to then see what probably could be missed. So one of the things that we often joke about is the fact that male organizations are very willing to deal with issues of capitalism. But then when it comes to patriarchy, they're not willing. They're like, no, they are delegated to the peripheral, to the margin. They're like, let's focus on the bigger issues. We're going to focus on transnational corporations and all these other issues around whether women are in the room, whether they are part of decision making, whether they're being included and consulted. They say, no, don't focus on those small issues. Let's keep our eyes on the ball, which is really dealing with capitalism. And so applying an intersectional lens is also one of the things, being able to cede power. So even when you're in the room and you recognize, okay, I have been invited to this space, but maybe I should have ceded this space to someone else, and who is most impacted by the issue that you're actually speaking about and is probably able to explain their lived reality. And again, that's also a feminist principle, ensuring that we're not just looking at hard data, that we can also bring into this conversation the lived realities of women and girls in all their diversity. So I would say those are some of the feminist principles that are helping in terms of advancing our work.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that insightful conversation, Eunice. Now to Nyawira. What then would you say, given your extensive experience with working alongside adolescent girls and young women from rural communities, specifically in Kenya, what role do you believe gender-responsive financing plays in addressing, I would put it this way, their unique challenges that they face?
Yeah, I feel that if budgeting was truly gender responsive, girls would have their sexual reproductive health rights met. It would not be a question of debate in parliament. It would be seamless. You know, girls would have access to pads in school. We wouldn't have dropouts in such high numbers or girls missing school days because they lack pads, which translates to their academic performance, which translates to newspaper highlights about, you know, boys performing better than boys, right? And, you know, that intersectional lens that Eunice speaks of is also something we apply in our work, especially when we work with schools in the community, to say girls are not failing because they're not smart. If you look at this through an intersectional lens, there are other factors which affect girls specifically because they're girls that don't impact boys the same way, right? So if gender responsive financing was truly gender responsive, those are some of the day-to-day unique challenges that girls would not face, right? Girls would have access to contraceptives in hospitals without healthcare practitioners asking them why they need condoms, you know, at a young age, questioning them why they need to be on the pill, etc. Comprehensive sexual education would be taught in school. There would be specific budget allocations to teaching boys and girls in equal measure about using age-appropriate CSE would be taught in school, and there would be resources to back that up, capacity building, you know, for the teachers to teach that, right? There would be provisions for medical supplies in Kenya. I know in many hospitals, particularly, I'm sure even in urban areas, but I speak to the rural areas because that's where I work. You're asked to carry gloves to go to the hospital if you're going to give birth. You're asked to carry, you know, basic supplies that a hospital should be supplying. So if gender responsive budgeting was truly gender responsive, those are not things, those are not issues we would be having in the day-to-day lives, and that girls would, and young women and women generally, non-binary folk would access health, would access health with no problem, with no discrimination, with all supplies available, right? So that is one. I feel that when it comes to schools, for example, even water sources in school, in rural areas, the Resource Center for Women and Girls worked with a particular school where girls only had 5 liters allocation of water per day. You're supposed to drink that water, you're supposed to wash with it, you're supposed to wash your clothes with it. And when you think about it, you're carrying a 2-liter bottle, especially in this hot Nairobi, and you're going to drink it before midday. That was a girl's allocation for her needs in a school. So how is that girl supposed to focus, concentrate, and perform in equal measure with a boy in the same school, in the same area? So those are some things when you think about gender responsive budgeting, we should really be able to translate what does that exactly mean for people who have no access or have limited access to resources, to health resources, to education resources, to water resources and food resources. What does it mean? So I think that's what I would say.
Thank you, Nyawera. Maybe just to inquire further on some of the cultural and institutional barriers that you've highlighted while implementing gender responsive finances through your own career. How then would you, or rather, how else would you suggest or recommend ways to overcome some of these cultural institutional barriers? You've mentioned the sexual health agenda and things around women having to carry gloves to the hospitals. So I guess my question to build on to what you just said would be, how would you suggest we overcome them? And especially when it comes to the resource Center for Women and Girls, how then has it transformed the lives of women and girls by investing in?
Right. So I think I borrow from what Eunice also spoke about, because our work is similar in a way. We just target an age that is below the age that AMWA works with. And when it comes to, there's a lot of power struggle in communities, even in responding to some of these challenges. You find that people will only work in a certain area if they're getting recognition for it, if there's an award for it, if there's a monetary value attached to it. And our approach has always been a feminist analysis and approach to working, which has power sharing and seeding at the central part of it. So if we are strong in capacity building of teachers, we would then work with healthcare practitioners, policymakers to say, why don't we come together and see how we can deliver or ensure that the policies that exist in terms of gender responsive budgeting and financing are reaching the people they need to. So we do this part of the job, you do this part of the job. It's a win-win situation for everybody, especially the people who need these services the most. So there's that power struggle is a challenge, right? There's also, of course, religious and cultural connotations to this kind of work, right? In my experience, we have been accused of, furthering our Western agenda because of advocating for the teaching of comprehensive sexual education in schools. And at the very, when you scratch the surface, it's really about power, right? And there's also a chronic lack of intellectual capacity, which means the thinkers we are also talking about, those people with the know-how, are missing in those spaces, right? And if you're only a few of you with that know-how, you know, with a majority without the technical and the intellectual know-how, you find yourself clashing of ideologies. There's a clashing, or there's a power struggle, right? Even when there need not be, those power struggles will show up, they will come up. So I would say that has been a central part of it. And one of the ways we have responded to that is by working with these stakeholders, people of influence and power holders in community, just as a way to reassure that we want the same thing. Our approach may be different, and you know, cultures may be different, but in the end, the agenda is the same. And by bringing them on board and making them allies and explaining and expanding how the strategy we use does not contradict or clash with their ideologies has been one of the ways that we have been able to navigate that challenge. It's not easy, and of course, attitude and mindset change takes a long time, but it's a step in the right direction towards working in this sector and furthering this agenda.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mara, for your insights. Now we go back to Lorna. I guess my question for you would be around policy discussions. I know we talked about policy recommendations at the beginning, but as someone who's deeply engaged in policy discussions, what role do you see gender-responsive financing playing in advancing sustainable development and gender equality, especially in South Sudan?
Well, thank you very much. I think gender-responsive budgeting and gender equality, there is a lot we need to do in order to advance those discourse in policy making spaces and in policy boardrooms. I think as my colleagues were speaking, I was listening and asking myself, how do we break that down? And this brings me to the question of either the gender activists are not communicating well, or they are communicating well, but their audience is not at a level of understanding what exactly they're saying. So the question of how I think we need to use multifaceted approach. And for me, the multifaceted approach is to look at the issues. What are the issues? When we talk about these issues that we have categorized as gender-related issues, and in some cases, as women, we have owned them as women's issues. They're not only women's issues, there are societal issues. Sometimes it's important for us to put the issues back in the center as societal issues. I have been a great critic of having women's issues addressed on the sidelines. Women's issues have to be addressed in the center. And women's issues, if we call them as women's issues, then we get a lot of, sometimes when we do that, we get a lot of resistance. But when we table them as human issues, human rights issues, then they're able to sail through. So I think it requires the ability to understand, and that's why I often talk about what strategy are we using. And when I talk about strategy, it's not the bandwagon use of the word strategy. We need to be very strategic in a point to an extent that as gender activists, ask yourself, why do I want to table this issue in this way? Why do I want to table it as a women's issue, or why do I want to table it as a human rights issue? And again, you'll forgive me, I'm a very why person. The why, prepare the why first. If you're clear about the why, you'll be able to choose the how. So I think sometimes we get it wrong. The why is right, but then we don't do a good work at the how, or sometimes we jump at doing it at the how level. And like, for example, earlier on, I told you my recommendation would be adapt gender responsive budgeting as a policy. Why? because then it will help us to be able to take that. For me, it will, if it's adopted as a policy, it will allow us to talk about gender responsiveness of the budget process and the budget contents at all levels, whether it's at ceiling setting level, whether it's at executive, whether it's at parliament. So if we do that, then you realize that at the level of executive, we have institutions like Ministry of Gender. The fact that the country has adopted gender responsive budgeting as a policy, as a principle, that gives them an entry point. But then in Parliament, they will be able to look at the priorities and the specifics of the budget and see how does that respond to the policy that the country has adopted. That gives opportunity to activists and all the other change makers to be able to scrutinize the budget, but then raise the issue at the right point, because then it will clearly be identified where did we lose it. I think one of the things that we need to do is to pick a recommendation and break down that recommendation into actual implementation. Many a times when we give recommendation, we say it's done and we go away. In the policy spaces, it doesn't go that way. It has to be broken down, and sometimes it needs to be broken down to a level of a submission. So now the other how is that we need to develop actual submissions and be able to take the submissions through the seats we have in those spaces. And the submissions should be well thought. I tell my colleagues that when you're making a submission, think about it as if you are the one who have the responsibility to provide the language for that provision. Give the language as precise as it is, as you would have wanted it to be. Don't give a lot of stories, because in the policy boardrooms, there is no time for listening to stories. Give the actual thing. And all the stories, let's do the stories out in the preparation, but send the messenger with a precise message. Like, for example, all the many things that we are talking about, when we were having this discussion, I just jotted down the recommendation and I was asking myself, okay, if this is it, why and how? You know, the thing is, you realize that all this, one of the panelists talked about the interconnection of the issues. And earlier on, I talked about the fact that women's rights are human rights, gender issues are societal issues. Basically, in some places, you don't have to talk about gender-responsive budgeting, because that's not the language they understand. But you can talk about open budget. You know, if you look at the concept of open budget or citizen-driven budget, it's actually talking about participatory governance. And if you look at participatory governance in depth, it's actually talking about gender-responsive processes. And if they're not listening to us talk about gender budgeting, if you talk about gender budgeting, you realize that in this space it's not working, then change the tact. Talk about open budget. And then change the tact. Talk about participatory governance. Budget is a governance instrument. So I think for me, the how is the ability to adapt at different stages, at different levels. And that calls for having internal preparation as gender rights or gender justice activists to be able to understand the issues comprehensively, but also how to articulate the issues. And we may want to look at these issues from a very emotional way sometimes. But at times it's important to switch and look at it in its real form. What are we talking about? We are talking about resources, and resources is power. And there's no the power, this kind of power does not just come easily. Women, or those who are taking women's interest, those who are taking youth interest into those spaces, those who are taking children interest into those spaces, have to galvanize certain kind of strength and ability. And this is not physical strength, it's intellectual capacity. How intellectually are we prepared to advance the recommendations that we have been given? Because, for example, if I'm asked, I say, okay, African countries should adopt gender-responsive policy, gender-responsive budgeting as a principle of budgeting. Then if I'm asked, Lorna, how do you want us to do that? I should have the answer. That can be anchored in the Constitution and in the Financial Act of, in the Public Finance Management and Accountability Act of a country. You know, those two are the entry points for this particular policy. But if I take this policy and I go to push this policy at a forum where people are talking about investment for the country, I think I will be missing the point. So that strategic and critical lens need to be developed.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lorna, for your very illuminating views on policy discussions and how to move further in terms of just, you know, being left as recommendations as opposed to just developing them as submissions. You mentioned a few pointers around participatory governance, budget as a governance tool, intellectual capacity. So then I think my follow-up question would only be fitting if I inquired what are some of your successful strategies that you've used not only to access the policy space, but also to influence it.
Thank you very much. Maybe if I can pick the last two. One of the strategies and one of the things that we need to appreciate, whether it's gender justice activists, gender rights activists, women rights activists, is that it can never be done alone. It's not a thing that you want to do alone so that it's said it's me. No. So one of the strategies is that when you get into these spaces, understand the rule of the game in that space. Immediately you'll start to see opportunities. And that's how we got the position of a gender advisor. And actually the Public Finance Management Reform Oversight Committee in South Sudan was established without Ministry of Gender. It was the question of a Ministry of Gender was brought on the table to counter that. And then I quickly latched onto that. We need to have that. So in that case, the Minister of Gender is in the room, but then still she's not the gender advisor because she equally holds the same status like other ministers. We still need the gender advisor. But if you look at it, it's a gain. We are kind of gaining and building momentum. For me, the strategy is that ask for more space, but then whichever cards that you have in the room, use them correctly. And number two is the question of allies. You know, sometimes in women's spaces, I must say this, we tend to think that it's them versus us. But it's not like that. You realize that there are male allies who are waiting for signal from those who are feeling the pinch of the shoes. And sometimes our signal may not be correct. So we also need to be strategic in how we build allies. For me, in the spaces where I find myself as the only female, then I build allies. And when we have the male allies on board, you realize that it ceases to be an individual issue. It becomes a societal issue. It doesn't have to be pointed or mentioned as a women's issue. We're doing this for women because it's raised, but now it becomes an agenda in the center. I think if we manage to achieve that, then you see progress. And that can only be achieved by being vigilant and be able to see the spaces. And sometimes you asked of example. One of the examples, I remember when I was still at the National Constitution Amendment Committee, the question of oral submission. And I think we were discussing about oral submission. At first, oral submissions were not there, but after a very long struggle, we managed to get it in the current version of the National Constitution Amendment Committee. And I was asked, what are women coming to say on security laws? And I'm like, wait a minute. Security is not only about men and guns. Security is a broader issue, it's a societal issue. Allow them. So sometimes, even if a situation is painted as if your advocacy is so embarrassing, you need to brave it until you reach a point when the actors come in the room and they are able to demonstrate their competence and ability. Then from there, it creates another ladder for you to climb and be able to echo the concerns in a more louder way. So I think basically the strategy is working with others, but also be keen and strategic to identify the opportunities that might arise. You might not see some of them from outside, but you will see the opportunities as events unfold. So that means as an activist in that space, you have to be an all-round person. And I think the other thing we need to do when we bring people on, we bring others on board, as activists, we should be talking about technical support, because then the technical support helps you to see the gray areas that you may not be seeing. And I think that for me has worked very well with the public finance management reform process, because at the oversight committee, we only have one seat for civil society, but then my colleague who comes as the technical person helps to see the gray areas that I may not see when I have the microphone at hand. So that kind of calculation is also very important. I hope I answered you, Halima.
Yes, you did. I know we're pressed.
Hello?
And just to be very keen on that, so that we stay within the time limits and I don't have to take much more of your day, I would then just jump right into a reflective question as we wrap this up and ask across the board. Reflecting on each of your individual experiences, what advice would you give to emerging leaders and activists who are eager to champion gender-responsive financing and drive meaningful change in their communities? How would you suggest they get involved? Maybe in a sentence or two.
Could I go first? Thank you, Halima. This has been a very interesting conversation, and thank you for convening us. For me, my advice would really be one, raising our own consciousness on these issues is important, because it helps you to be able to do deep analysis. That's what the world needs right now in a poly crisis. I think the world is looking for new ways, new approaches, new strategies, and new tactics of doing things. And so raising political consciousness is important, but I would also add that it would have to be collective, because I think on our own, there's a limit to how much we can do. So doing it collectively as well helps us to see the things that we need to see with different eyes. So I would say for me, that's what I would advise my younger self. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eunice.
I stand on what Eunice said. Building our own knowledge base is critical. You cannot give what you don't have. So if the knowledge is not there, you can't transfer it. So that's key. Also learning, transnational exchange, I believe. Learning from others in other contexts, what works, borrowing lessons, and some of the information gaps they didn't see, some knowledge gaps they weren't aware of in their journey, in their processes. I think that kind of exchange is powerful, so that we don't replicate the mistakes and borrow the success models and strategies they used.
Thank you, Nyama. Lorna, your version of the parting shot.
Thank you very much. My version of the parting shot is a reflection that I have all the time, and I tell younger people who get into these spaces that the spaces are too hostile such that they may change your personality. Therefore, keep a support system And that's one thing that we've not perfected, but we need to do that, keep a support system. But number two is that as an individual in that space, the advice I would give is the moment you enter at the doors of these boardrooms for making big decisions for the benefit of common good or women, forget about yourself. It's not you. It's about those who are outside but could not get the opportunity to be in that room. So whichever thing that comes out of your mouth should be for their benefit. That means you're gaining more mileage for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorna. Once again, thank you, Eunice, Nyawira, and Lorna, for joining us today, for being very, very gracious in allowing me to moderate this conversation. I think I've learned a lot from this wonderful conversation. I was writing some of these things down in order for me to go back and just reflect on some of the things that you've said, from regressive taxation, budget financing, some highlights around building transnational systems that Eunice mentioned, sexual health for women having to be addressed, as Ivy mentioned, and just, I think, overall understanding the game that Lorna mentioned. All of this to say that I am deeply and personally grateful for all three of you making the time, for impacting so much of your experience and knowledge on us today, and for graciously accepting the invitation to begin with. So thank you very much, Lorna, Nyawira, and this has brought us to the end of our conversation. And I'd like to say thank you and goodbye.